When we think of secret writing during the Middle Ages, we often imagine manuscripts and ciphers, but runes, too, were used to hide meaning in systematic and surprisingly creative ways. Let's try to solve the puzzle. Hello, Rune Scholar, wherever and whenever you are. I'm the modern Erilar, and in my last episode, I did a detailed walkthrough of the encryption methods used on the Runic runestone, explaining the shift ciphers, coordinate runes, obsolete Futharks, and graphic substitutions used to encode its text. But there are more ways that historical rune writers encoded messages using runes. So today, let's do a deep dive into some additional types of secret runes, including starting to look at those used after the Viking Age. In a moment, we'll look at a rune stick where the beard of a carved face encodes runic letters. This kind of system is what Aslak Liestøl called Lønnruner, a script that uses a system to render runes incomprehensible to all but those who understand the system. He emphasized that the reader must understand the Futhark, the runic alphabet, and have a key to unencoding the information. Without both, the inscription remains visually clear, but bereft of meaning. Substitution ciphers encrypt the plain text of a message by replacing units, usually letters, in a defined manner, sometimes with another letter or a symbol. In inscription O.R. Barnes 15 from Maes Howe in Orkney, we can see an example of this in the message Twig reist runar theisr. Twig carved these runes. Some plain text values here are represented by multiple characters. The rune writhe, for example, has 2 possible characters. Coordinate ciphers also appear in several locations and take on graphic forms that do not resemble those shown here on the Runic runestone. We understand coordinate ciphers by dividing the Futhark and then describing the position of the rune. The first number indicates in which division, or 8, the rune appears, and then the second indicates the position within the 8 that the rune occupied. In many inscriptions, the 8s are not listed in their intuitive order within the Futhark, with the most common order being 3, 2, 1 inside of Scandinavia. The best key that we have to the system actually comes from Schleswig. This 11th century rib bone shows us very clearly that the 8s are listed in 3, 2, 1 order, with the dots at the top of the rune row indicating the beginning of each 8. And then the position of the rune is indicated by dots at the bottom of the row by each rune within the 8. So Bjarkan, for example, is the second rune in the 8 numbered 1. And what all examples of coordinate runes will share is not their shape, but their logic, physical marks that stand in for abstract coordinates. And once you see the logic, the surface variety stops being overwhelming. One of the more common ways that coordinate or binary runes are expressed is Twig runes. In episode 15 on Orkney, I talked about examples of Twig runes. Inscription O.R. Barnes 9 consists of 2 lines of plain runes followed by this line of Twig runes. The coded line can be transliterated as 2, 4, 3, 5, 1, 4, 2, 3, 3, 6, 3, 5, Arlikr, probably the name Erlinger, the name of the person carving the runes. These Twig runes also appear in O.R. Barnes 20 here in Maes Howe and at O.R. 4 at the Ring of Brodgar, about 3 kilometers away. In addition to looking a little like trees here, Twig runes can take on some fantastic forms. For example, this runestick from Bergen features bearded faces, where the coordinates are expressed in the lines of the beard to write the phrase, as one's life. The rest of the message is broken off, so unfortunately that's all we can read. A second coordinate rune option gives us a possible answer to an intriguing question. If, as I mentioned in several episodes on medieval and early modern runes, the dotted runes were never formally a part of a full Futhark rune row, how might one attempt to include a dotted rune in a coordinate cipher? This question only arises once rune writers start to treat the Futhark as a flexible system, reintroducing voiced consonants, for example, rather than a fixed alphabet. Jonas Nordby noticed that N B287 features coordinates shown using fish fins, and the last fish, with coordinates that point to an is rune, itself has spots. This may be a way to indicate a dotted is rune, which stands for a short sound, so this inscription may be trying to write the name Arne. This particular rune stick also shows us several other possible modalities for creating coordinate runes, like lines of various lengths and systems of dots. If you'd like me to do a deep dive on this artifact, let me know in the comments, but we as rune scholars have some clearer examples of these modalities that can be simpler for teaching. And as I just mentioned, coordinate runes communicated using lines of different lengths. Here we have a clear example. Rune writers can use these to communicate the aet and the position, and when they are vertical lines, sometimes these are called is-runes or isrunar because the isals or is rune is just a vertical stroke. And in the isrunar system, the rune graph itself disappears, leaving only the logical structure behind. On the runestone, the rune writer uses long strokes to indicate the aet, with the aets again arranged 3-2-1, and the short strokes indicate the position within the aet. So here we have Eirikr, the signature of the rune writer Erik. The short strokes are all to the same side of the rune row here, but in this bone artifact from Sigtuna, the short lines alternate from one side to the other, sometimes to the top, sometimes to the bottom. And in addition, the verticality is reversed, by which I mean that the short lines indicate the aet and the long lines indicate the position. So the logic stays constant even when the visual grammar is changing. This verticality matches that shown and described in the St. Gall manuscript, where we can see an example of isrunar embellished with division marks. This manuscript is from the Anglo-Saxon tradition and commonly called the isruna tract, which survives in multiple copies. This manuscript tells us that runic coding wasn't just Scandinavian, it was practiced across multiple cultures, and emphasizes how the shift from carving to writing changes how these systems develop. The Anglo-Saxon Futhark took a different developmental path than the Scandinavian younger Futhark rune rows. So we need to ensure that we're clear and balanced about what the two systems did or did not have in common. And for example, the aets here are listed in 1, 2, 3 order, the opposite order to that typically used in Scandinavia. You can also see that the rune in the second position is supposed to be in an 8th position within an 8. So the rune rows here are the Anglo-Saxon Futhark, where the 8s are necessarily longer than 6 because there are a greater number of runes in the Futhark. On the Volstestone, on the other hand, we see a combination of Twig runes and is runes, but the principles are the same, and this inscription is back in Scandinavia, written in a younger Futhark, where the aets are again 3-2-1. This medieval runestick from Bergen is inscribed with a very particular pattern. This seems to be a younger Futhark itself, written out, but missing the final ir rune. The Fehu rune appears first once, then twice, then 3 times, and then in the position where O's would occur, this rune is an O's. And then it appears twice, then 3 times, and then the Hoggle rune appears where it should, and so on. And this seems to be a type of encoding for the Futhark that relies on 5 divisions of the Futhark. These 5-part systems are rare and only start appearing in the 11th century. They show rune writers moving from tradition to experimentation and from inherited practice to deliberate system building. The only other inscription that I know about as of early 2026 that features a 5-part division of the Futhark is a Bodleian manuscript originally composed on the Welsh marches with later additions. Interestingly, instead of an Anglo-Saxon Futhark, the rune row recorded here is a younger Futhark. Maybe this is because it's in the Danelaw. The twigs coming off the runes of the middle line indicate that the Futhark could be divided into 3 sections in 3 to 1 order, whereas the bottom line divides the rune row into 5 sections. What these rare 5-part divisions of the Futhark suggest is that rune writers were not transmitting inherited systems only. They were actively experimenting with how rune rows could be structured, subdivided, or encrypted. The examples from the Bodleian Library and from Bergen show that medieval rune writers may have seen runes as tools for intellectual play and inquiry. In our next episode, we will follow this trajectory further into the early modern period, examining the runic codes preserved in a 16th century Icelandic manuscript called Membrana, which was transmitted to us by a later manuscript called the Runologia. This Icelandic material highlights the transition from living practical script into cryptographic theory. Runes stop being simply used and start being theorized. Thank you for reading the runes with me, the modern Erilar.